The night had been quiet, the kind of silence only the frontier knew, where every creak of wood and distant coyote call seemed louder than thunder. James Callahan had lived alone on his stretch of land for 7 years, carving a life out of wilderness that didn't want him there. He had fought drought, wolves, and loneliness, but nothing had prepared him for the sound he heard when he stepped outside with his lantern. A figure was collapsed in the dirt by his corral, small and trembling. When he knelt, lantern light revealed a girl no older than 15, her dress torn, her dark eyes wide with exhaustion. She whispered in a tongue he only half recognized, Comanche. James's hand went instinctively to the rifle slung on his shoulder, but then he froze. Her face was streaked with tears, her body weak, like she had been running for miles. He had no business interfering. Settlers who crossed into Comanche affairs rarely lived to tell of it. And yet, as she clutched at his boot with shaking hands, whispering something he didn't understand, James felt the old war inside him stir, the part of him that remembered what it was like to be hunted, helpless. He lifted her into his arms, carried her inside, and laid her on the cot by the fire. All night she slept, burning with fever. James sat nearby, feeding her water and stew in small spoonfuls when she stirred. He told himself he'd send her back at dawn, that this was temporary, but deep down he knew he had already crossed a line. A Comanche child on his land, under his roof, was not a guest. It was a declaration. If anyone saw her here, his life wouldn't be worth a plug nickel. Still, when the sun rose, she woke and whispered something soft, almost like thanks. He found himself smiling despite his fear. "You're safe here," he said, though he doubted she understood his English. The morning stretched on uneasy. James tended to his chores, feeding the mule, patching the fence, but his eyes kept drifting back to the cabin where the girl sat quietly, watching him through the open doorway. There was something in her gaze, proud yet fragile, like a fawn that refused to bow its head. He didn't ask what she was running from. He didn't want to know. It was enough that she was there, alive, and that for one night, he had kept her that way. But when the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of distant drumming, James's blood ran cold. He climbed the ridge by his barn and looked to the horizon. His heart sank. A line of horsemen appeared against the rising sun, shadows at first, then shapes, then the undeniable truth. Dozens of warriors rode hard across the plain, lances gleaming, eagle feathers streaming. He counted quickly, pulse hammering. 50, 60, more. By the time they spread into a circle around his homestead, there were nearly 70. And at their head rode a tall figure, his face painted in streaks of red and black, eyes burning with fury. James's rifle felt suddenly too light in his hands. He looked back at the cabin, where the girl stood frozen, her small body framed in the doorway. Her lips parted in recognition, and she whispered one word with terror and awe, "Father." The truth slammed into James like a hammer. He hadn't rescued a runaway. He had taken the daughter of a chief. And now, his house stood surrounded by 70 Comanche warriors, their bows drawn, their spears ready, and every eye fixed on him. James's throat went dry. He could already see how this ended. Blood, fire, and the girl torn from his arms. But as the chief raised his hand, the warriors waiting for his command, James did the only thing he knew how. He stepped forward, rifle lowered, heart pounding, and prayed that courage alone might buy him a few more breaths of life. The air was so still it felt like the world had stopped breathing. 70 riders sat on their ponies, silent as carved stone, encircling James's homestead like a tightening noose. The chief remained at the front, his hand still raised, his eyes locked on the girl in the doorway. James could feel the weight of that gaze, sharp as a knife pressed against his throat. He swallowed hard and took another step forward, hands spread wide to show he wasn't aiming his rifle. His voice cracked the silence, low but steady. "She came here half dead. I gave her water, food, nothing more." The chief's eyes narrowed, though his hand did not drop. He spoke in Comanche, his voice like thunder rolling off the mountains. The girl replied quickly, words spilling out with desperation. James couldn't understand them, but the tone was clear, pleading, explaining, maybe even defending him. A ripple passed through the warriors, some frowning, others glancing at one another. They had expected to see their chief's daughter cowering in chains, or worse. Instead, she stood unharmed, wrapped in one of James's blankets, her body steady though her eyes still wet with tears. The chief dismounted with the grace of a panther, his feet hitting the dirt without a sound. Every warrior tightened their grip on bow or lance, watching for the smallest sign of aggression. James's pulse roared in his ears. He kept his arms raised, but his voice hardened. If you're gonna kill me, do it. But know this, I didn't harm her. I sheltered her when she needed it. His words hung in the air, useless to men who might not even understand his tongue. Yet the chief's daughter translated, her voice trembling but strong, repeating his words in Comanche. The chief stopped only a few feet away. He was taller than James expected, his shoulders broad beneath the wolf pelt draped over him, his face painted with the symbols of war. His eyes were cold fire, and when he spoke again, it was directly to James, in broken English that carried the weight of generations. Why, help her? James almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Why indeed? He thought of his wife, buried 10 years in the rocky soil behind the barn. He thought of the child she had lost before she died, the child that had never taken a breath. He thought of the silence that had followed him ever since, the emptiness he had tried to fill with work, whiskey, and solitude. Looking into the chief's unflinching eyes, James answered with nothing but the truth. Because no one else would. The words landed heavy, not just in English, but when the girl repeated them in her people's tongue. A hush spread through the warriors, a silence deeper than before. Some looked at their chief, waiting. Others studied James, measuring the steadiness in his voice, the lack of fear in his stance. He was a man alone, surrounded by death, yet he hadn't begged, hadn't lied, hadn't raised his gun. Only told the truth. The chief turned at last to his daughter, his expression shifting, though only slightly. He spoke to her in a rapid string of words, questions wrapped in command. She answered firmly, her chin raised. There was no mistaking it now, she was not begging. She was vouching for him. Defending him. The fire in her voice softened the storm in her father's eyes. James dared to lower his hands, just slightly. He met the chief's gaze one last time. She's your blood, she belongs with you. But remember, I didn't keep her. I kept her alive. His words echoed across the circle. The chief studied him long and hard, then slowly raised his hand again, not in threat, but in signal. The warriors shifted in their saddles, their weapons lowering. The circle broke, if only a fraction, enough for the air to move again. But James knew the test was not over. The chief's silence was not forgiveness. It was judgment, delayed, and whether he would live another day, or whether this house would burn before nightfall, would depend on what happened next. The standoff seemed endless, as if time itself had frozen on the edge of violence. The warriors still encircled the homestead, their ponies restless, snorting clouds of steam into the cold morning air. James could feel every heartbeat pounding against his ribs, could feel the sweat beating at the back of his neck. His rifle hung heavy at his side now, but he made no move for it. He knew one twitch would bring 70 arrows through his chest before he could draw a breath. Still, he stood tall, refusing to shrink under the gaze of the painted chief. The girl stepped forward then, her bare feet touching the frozen earth, blanket falling from her shoulders. She reached for her father's arm, speaking quickly, her words urgent, raw with emotion. James couldn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. He saw the way she pointed to the cabin, then to the scars on her feet, then to him. Every motion was testimony, every gesture a plea. The chief listened without a word, his face carved from stone, but his eyes flickered, once, twice, betraying something softer beneath the mask. Finally, the chief raised his hand, palm open, and the warriors stilled. He stepped closer to James until only an arm's length separated them. The silence was so deep that even the horses seemed to listen. "You, no friend of Comanche," the chief said slowly, his English halting, guttural. "But, you give her life. You show heart." His gaze bore into James's, searching, testing, as though looking for weakness or deceit. Finding none, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His knees threatened to give way beneath him, but he locked them firm. He didn't thank the man, didn't dare. Gratitude might be mistaken for weakness. Instead, he met the chief's nod with a grim one of his own, man to man, warrior to warrior, though James had long since traded battlefields for plows and fences. The chief turned then, gesturing for his daughter. She hesitated, her dark eyes flicking once to James. Something passed between them in that glance, trust, gratitude, maybe even sorrow. She whispered something soft, a word James couldn't catch, before she went to her father's side. He draped the wolf pelt across her shoulders, lifting her up onto his horse with a gentleness that belied the fearsome image he carried. The girl looked back one last time as the warriors began to move, their circle breaking like a tide withdrawing to sea. 70 riders melted back across the plain, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon, until only the chief remained. He lingered, his horse pawing at the earth, his eyes fixed on James. "We remember," he said at last, his voice a promise and a warning both. "One day, this thing, maybe save you. Maybe not, but we remember." With that, he wheeled his horse and galloped after his people, vanishing into the rising sun. The silence that followed was deafening. James stood alone in his yard, his cabin behind him, the churned earth before him scarred by 100 hooves. He leaned on his rifle, shoulders sagging as the weight of what had just passed sank in. He had faced 70 warriors, a father's wrath, and death itself. And somehow, he was still standing. But as he turned back toward the cabin, the image of the girl's eyes haunted him. She had left, yes, but a part of her plea, her trust, lingered inside those log walls. James knew his life would never again be as it had been. The prairie had a way of remembering, and so did the Comanche. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon, a chief and his daughter carried with them the memory of a lone white man who chose mercy over fear, and whose choice had spared his life, at least for now.